Sir Ian, thank you very much for having us in the Science Museum today and for making time for us.
My pleasure.
Thank you. I have to say it's a particular honor for me because this institution has had a big effect in my life and my family. As a son of a scientist, as you know, my father was a professor of theoretical physics and mathematics in Armenia during the Soviet Union, and then later on in Cambridge University here. So science was always part of our family, always discussions. We had academics come and go throughout our house and our lives all the time. So this has always been a fascinating topic for me. Not only that, growing up in the Soviet Union, my father used to talk about the Science Museum when we had not come here yet. And he would say, oh, you have to wait till you see this place, it's amazing.
It became a myth in your mind.
It was a mystery.
Yes.
It was a myth.
Yes.
UK was a myth and a mystery, and so beyond that Iron Curtain, we were trying to peek through and see what was this wondrous place. It really was, as two young boys, my brother and I. And I won't ever forget being here and coming to the Science Museum for the first time and being absolutely mesmerized. And and lastly, in the words of my 9-year-old boy, when I told him this morning that I'm seeing you, he said, please tell him that I like it very much and it's the best science museum in the world. So.
Well, that's encouraging as a message from your son, because what often happens to me is that I get that message with a caveat at the end, which is, I love the Science Museum, but could the director do the following things for me? They want new exhibits or new stories. So it's nice to have a simple message rather than a complex one.
But I think that's a brilliant generation that you're catering for as well, that young generation, educating them and setting their lives towards a particular path. You certainly had that effect on me and my life. Seeing these things come to life in your museum, it does something. It teaches a young mind and opens their mind.
Well, that's great to know, because one of the things that's very important about the work we do here is to try and show science and its impact in real lives, because we have, for example, the biggest school audience of any museum in Europe. And you ask yourself why, and it's because we don't follow school curriculum. So although we want people to learn science, we're not here to be another form of teaching. And people love the way we illustrate what real scientists are doing, also the history of the subject, and sort of making it live and breathe and sing, actually, is the way I would put it, rather than being a great body of work that you must learn, and it's all about tests at the end of it.
Yeah, especially the younger generation, there's an element of being engaged and entertained and everything come to life in that sense. Yeah.
Well, I think the other thing that's very important for our work is probably the biggest single group that come to the museum are families. And in the kind of digital age, it's amazing how an analog thing, a visit to a museum, is becoming more and more valued, because it's an opportunity for a family to kind of learn things together. And it's amazing watching the family groups here, because you can never quite tell what the dynamic's going to be. So you assume that wise parents or grandparents are teaching their children about the science that they're looking at. Invariably, it's totally the other way around. And when we have this joke that invariably you see some super bright 7-year-old girl explaining, for example, a cancer treatment or some physics to their parents, and that's kind of wonderful, actually.
It's definitely the case in my household.
Right.
No, it's they're getting to that age when they're so engaged in their particular topics that there's a constant education from their side, which makes me want to dig into the topic even further. That's great. So I have to say thank you for all your hard work. And you've been doing this for quite a while, right?
Well, I've been doing it for 13 years.
Amazing.
It is kind of amazing, first of all, because I can't believe how quickly time has moved. But also, my joke with many colleagues, if you look at the world generally, in the world of the public sector or business, it used to be quite common for people to spend quite a long time doing senior jobs. And then there was a period where every chief executive, if you read the FT, seems to do a job for 3 or 4 years. And when I started here, given the big things I wanted to achieve, I remember curators saying to me, can you please drop anchor, which is a wonderful way of putting it, which is to stay and try and do some really big strategic things.
Have a long-term plan.
Yeah. Like all
few
people
things.
who've done a job a long time, in my mind, I still feel like I'm 12, and I think that's what
That's
matters
wonderful.
in terms of curiosity and energy.
And but if we can take a step back, you started your career in banking.
Yeah,
And then you were part of, and then there was a transition to a few arts
yeah,
institutions, Royal Academy of Arts, the Arts Council, there was a marketing agency as well.
That's right.
But you were still keeping that certain finance role within those institutions.
When I left university in '86, by far the most glamorous career in the world was being a banker. And it's quite funny now because bankers get a tough rap in terms of how a lot of young people see them. But no, I went to the Bank of England, also worked in mergers and acquisitions at BZW. And I think it's a very unusual background, but one that has been an enormous advantage here because you so often get people who've worked only in one sector having a very strange view of the world. And the truth is that innovation and great practice exists both in the private sector and also in the public sector. I was also using my financial background to come into the arts world. So I often say that my guilty secret is I'm also a chartered accountant, but don't tell anyone. But my point is that actually a business background is enormously helpful because it means that I relish corporate partnerships. I understand some of our rich donors in terms of the way they think, but also I just like doing things differently. And the public sector can be quite slow, quite risk averse, whereas I think perhaps the biggest thing I've taken from my time in the private sector is I enjoy risk. I have a phrase which I use with some rather cautious colleagues, which is that caution killed the cat. And what I mean is that so often people who are risk averse, in my experience, create more problems and more challenges than those who are prepared to take a punt and do something different.
But that must be difficult in the world of increasing compliance and being politically correct and being cautious on, and then you have to manage all of these different parties within the institution to align towards your vision. That takes a lot of skill.
It does. I think though that we don't take wild risks, and I think what we've developed as a skill set is to think about the narrative around what we're doing, because as long as you take a risk with some clear performance indicators at the end of it in terms of what success looks like, if it doesn't go well, at least you've got a narrative to explain what you were trying to achieve. So it's true, there is that risk, but also I think what's very important is that a lot of chief executives say something which they mean but don't deliver in practice. And what I'm trying to get at is that I encourage my colleagues to take risks. And if it doesn't go well, I like to think that I'm there for them. Because, of course, what so often happens, particularly in the public sector, is that when things go wrong, the chief executive runs for the hills and, looking for deniability or blame. And I would say a lot of the really radical things we've done here, we've achieved because people know that actually I will be there for them if something goes wrong.
That's great leadership, yeah.
Well, I mean, one tries to do it. I mean, clearly, when things do go wrong, it's irritating and you regret it. But actually, if you look at the big scheme of things, the upsides massively outweigh the downsides.
There's an interesting book written by a man called Jocko Willink, and it's called Extreme Ownership. He was a former Navy SEAL, now he's a businessman, he's growing in popularity. So he brings this concept from the Navy SEAL practice of, if you're doing something, if you're leading a team, you have to take extreme ownership in your leadership. So if it's somebody's fault, I'm, as a leader, happy to step in and say, I'm leading you, I'm your manager, we're in this together, rather than do what you suggested, people run for the hills.
Well, also a big part of
and blame others.
Yeah, and also a huge part of my job is dealing with politicians and explaining what we've done to them. I'm appointed by the Prime Minister, I'm directly accountable to Parliament, and that can be quite tough. And in a way, that involves occasionally quite a lot of flack. and rewriting of history by some politicians. But my job is to take that flak. That's why I'm here. I'm the kind of shock absorber. So my colleagues can get on with what they want to do without getting too stressed by that aspect of our life.
You're quite tough.
Well, I like to think after time, you also realise that actually if you stick to your guns and you are tough, that over time you build up respect from the people you're reporting to and from the political class. And also, what you also realise over time is politics is quite sophisticated. So I can think of many occasions when we've done something quite controversial, where privately the politicians criticising me would have said, actually, you're doing the right thing, but for political reasons I can't say that. Now, you may then think, oh, that all sounds a bit cynical, but actually it's just politics, and you have to respect the fact, as I often say to my colleagues, for all that occasionally politicians might drive us mad, they've had the guts to stand for office. They've got a mandate that I don't have, and actually in a democratic society you have to respect that their voice can sometimes be strident and difficult, but actually it is what democracy is founded on. So live with it and enjoy it.
Yeah, we have to hear all sorts of voices,
Yes.
and that's
Exactly.
one of the reasons why I, as a child growing up in the Soviet Union, I saw that stark difference. Being here and having that ability to speak about my opinions and hear about other people's opinions, and also have the politeness to agree to disagree sometimes. It's the beauty of this world.
I think the other thing that's really important in this job is we do a lot of audience research about what the public think. And so I often say that in the end, I'm a very old-fashioned Englishman in that I really, really believe in public service. And so on a whole range of issues, on both the left and the right, we get quite a lot of noise. So, we get a lot of grief from anti-vaxxers. We get a lot of grief from some eco-protesters. But what keeps our path sincere and true is audience research, because what it shows is that the exhibitions we do and the kind of collecting we do is of profound interest to them. And then we understand where we can add value to their lives. And in a way, that's the most important thing of all. So it's not my board of trustees or the minister I report to, it's the great British public. That's why I'm here. Yeah. And the great British public often have surprising and complex views on almost every subject, be it woke politics, be it sustainability. And I think that keeps you honest, understanding the data.
And learning the people.
Yeah.
Can we go back to your personal shift from banking into the arts? Were you always in the arts? Were you always interested?
Yeah, well, I grew up in a family where the arts were very important, particularly the visual arts and music. And in fact, music, as it happens, is my greatest love. And
listening or playing?
I play the piano, but I also used to sing with a choir.
Okay.
I
play the piano as well.
Yeah,
but you don't want to hear me sing.
No, well, yes. My fantasy is that one of these days I want a grand piano in my office, because I was once talking to the head of one of the great music colleges, who said that whenever he was in a meeting where someone was being boring, he would go to the grand piano in his office and start playing Cole Porter. And I think that would be quite a good way of, saying to people, this meeting is over. So the arts were also very important to me. And I suppose, although I enjoyed banking and I think I was good at it, in your 20s, you're having a sense of how you're going to map out your life. And for me, it's a very interesting looking at the decision I made to leave the city with hindsight, because I've reached a stage where so many of my friends stayed in the city as merchant bankers and lawyers, and they've made a lot of money, and good luck to them. But I think I've had a much more interesting life.
Fulfilling life.
Really, amazing. This is a job where on quite a regular basis, Nobel Prize winners pop in for a coffee, or a president of a country comes for a visit, or I meet some amazing aspiring research scientist. And the point is that I feel like 100% alive, because I'm just so full of optimism and realizing the new boundaries of knowledge. And so it feels like it was totally the right decision, but it also feels as if the background in finance and commerce was also a good foundation for understanding how to make things happen as well.
How to make the machine work.
Yes, making the machine work is a tough skill actually, because also you need to enjoy developing talent. I mean, one of the things that's been a joy running a big organization like this is spotting talent and promoting it. And I've lost count of the number of times when I promoted someone quite early in their career and people say, are they ready for it? To which my response is, well, of course they are. I can just see the talent is there and needs to be nurtured. And that, of course, is a huge thrill because we employ about 1,300 people and we have 5 museums in the group. So understanding the rise and fall of talent is one of the great joys of being a leader, actually.
It's all about the people that
it's totally about
bring
the
this
people.
all together.
And it's also about, perhaps the toughest thing about leadership, and you see it hugely debated these days, is trying to deal with a range of stakeholders. There was a wonderful front cover recently of The Economist, and it was chief executive being pulled in every direction. Because if you run any institution now, you have so many people to please. So obviously you have your investors in a company, but also you have the green agenda, you have a social justice agenda, you have all the hopes and dreams of your younger colleagues, you have politicians, you have the media. It's impossible to please everyone all the time, so you have to constantly recalibrate and understand whether you've got the balance right.
And then balance it with the concept of risk as well.
Yes, exactly.
That we were talking about.
Exactly.
And we always, the concept I pushed to my teams was that whichever way we operate, there's a risk involved.
Yeah.
What we try to get to is measurable risk.
Yeah.
So we can measure their risk and have different ways of remediating whatever issue it is that we have.
By the way,
that way you're well planned and you know where you're going at least more or less, rather than just, like you said, being completely stagnant, not doing anything, and that itself is a risk.
My favourite joke about risk is when I became chief executive, I was given lots of advice by people because, gosh, people love to give you advice. And most of it was rubbish. But one very wise comment was from a remarkable woman called Marjorie Scardino, who used to be head of Pearson. And Marjorie was on the board of the Victoria and Albert Museum, where I was deputy director. And she said, the only thing you need to understand about being a chief executive is the moment you become the boss, people will cease to tell you the truth. And that's all that matters, because you need to create a culture where people will tell you honestly what they think and won't be afraid to tell you about problems. And actually, time and time again over recent years, I realized what great advice that was. Because on the one hand, you have to achieve a kind of paradox, because you have to be driven, visionary, exacting, at the same time, whilst also signalling that actually you can cope with bad news, that you can be accessible and you will listen to counter-arguments. And those two grate against each other in a very tough way on a daily basis. But I always think about Marjorie's advice, because we live in a culture where every major institution or commercial organisation has these vast risk registers. And I'm quite sceptical about them, because I think actually what really matters is underlying skills. So adaptability and flexibility and open-mindedness, these are the things that help you cope with risks rather than over-planning them. Because invariably you do all that risk planning and the thing that goes wrong wasn't on the risk register anyway. So you might as well have not done the work.
And coming from the world of cybersecurity, we said there are infinite threats and some measured vulnerabilities. But you cannot plan for everything.
Yeah.
So you just said, like you said, you have to be agile. So the agile operation is what we used to strive to achieve.
It's very interesting you should say that about cyber. We did a wonderful project a couple of years ago, because GCHQ, the government's listening station for its intelligence agencies, was 100 years old, and we did an exhibition called Top Secret about their work. But although a lot of the early history was about 2 world wars and relationship with Russia, a huge section of the exhibition was about cybersecurity. And actually, it gets tougher and tougher. I mean, there's a big thing in Britain at the moment where the British Library, which is an amazing organisation, has suffered a huge cyber attack. And I would say we spend more and more time and money worrying about where that's going to come from, because the eloquence and visual brilliance of cyber attacks is now so strong that actually you think to yourself, oh, I wouldn't be fooled by a dangerous email, but of course one is endlessly. And so the vigilance in that area has become really acute, actually.
You have to. It's become a huge market. When I started, it was in the beginning stages of cybersecurity as we know it. People didn't understand what it meant. Was it every country had its own definition of cyber? For some it was information security, for others it was network security. All of these terms have now been determined and we know exactly what we're talking about. But it was a complete mess, and a lot of organizations, large organizations that we would talk to, they wouldn't have a clue on where to start and what to do. But at least there's a huge push towards awareness these days. I think being aware is one of the key principles of defense.
And I think it's an area where it runs to the heart of interesting questions about data itself, actually, because one of the big debates in Britain is that when you listen to domestic discussion here about the National Health Service, it's invariably a gloomy story about waiting lists and under-resourcing, and all those things might be true. But also, when I talk to scientists outside the UK, they say, well, the NHS is a simply remarkable institution with a data set of immense value in terms of pioneering medicine. And there is, at the moment, I think, no one's quite grappling with the question to what degree the NHS will become even more data-driven and whether patients will be happy to surrender that data. I mean, my personal view is that I'm not remotely worried about that, because I can see that actually the power of millions of data sets would be fantastic for medicine. But actually, I feel that that debate is still going round and round in circles, because the anxiety about data is the dominant voice, whereas the upside of taking the risk is not really being heard.
Do you think it's this concept of data and risk associated with data will shift as generations progress? Younger generations are a lot more willing to give their data away, whether it's on social media or others. They see more use for these things. It's my generation that holds it all back, and it's a little bit more cautious of where that data goes.
Well, Henry, we did an exhibition about 3 years ago called Big Data. And the reason we did it is because there was a period when there was a lot of discussion about big data. There was very, what's the right word, propagandist. And so a lot of kind of the Silicon Valley mafia were talking about big data is going to achieve all these wonderful things. And interestingly, when we decided to do this exhibition, quite a lot of major companies wanted to sponsor it, and we turned them down because we wanted to actually follow the audience research. And what it showed was that actually the public were not for or against big data or sharing their data. They just wanted to understand what already existed and how it would be used. And I think you're right. What the interesting thing, especially about the younger generations visiting, is that they were fairly chilled about the use of data, with some important caveats. So one of the things that has become a really big issue, especially for the younger audiences, is the degree to which big data and algorithms can bake in existing prejudice. So there's quite a lot of evidence about systems having implied sexism, racism, and those. So I would say for the audience that we're talking about, the young audience, they can see the upside, but they're also aware that they're happy to embrace this new data paradigm as long as they sense that someone is keeping an eye on the vulnerable or the biases and actually trying to address that. And of course, part of that is not only regulation, but also the other thing that certainly fascinates me, which is who's working in these industries. I mean, the example I always give is that in Silicon Valley, maybe 16, 70% of the people who work there are women, whereas Saudi Arabia, where we're doing some work at the moment, about 66% of IT graduates are women. And what I'm trying to say is the assumption is that the West alone has the right values and the right gender balance to solve these problems. it's considerably more sophisticated and nuanced than that. But the point remains that actually the big data world is exciting, but actually there is a sense we just need to regulate it properly.
Every time I mention regulation, I get resistance from my Silicon Valley colleagues.
Yeah.
And those that are involved in innovation. Well, rightly so, with the fear of overarching dramatic or draconian terms. And certainly with the regulation of AI that was discussed in the EU. I had friends from America fly in trying to influence and change that and reverse that push. But dovetailing, this is a nice segue to one of the topics I wanted to just ask you about your institution. What have you seen over this decade that you've been part of it, the fundamental large shifts in science, technology, and especially how we learn? Because at the end of the day, you are a learning institution. This is where we come to educate ourselves and educate our families and children. What are the large shifts that you've seen over the last
in terms
12,
of
13
our
years?
work?
In terms of in the scientific sector or the science sector, or in terms of technology, we touched on data and AI, and also on how we learn, how the public engages.
Well, I think the answer to that is that we've seen surprising trends. So I can remember probably 10, 15 years ago, everyone sort of predicted that in the digital age, museums would decline, that all learning and experiences would be online or in some virtual reality. Of course, exactly the opposite has happened.
Okay.
That the museum attendances have been rising. And so, first of all, what I call the shock of the old applies, which is analog learning still has a big place, and why do we have such an enormous schools audience, and why do our families come in big numbers? But also, what we've also seen is things that existed a few years ago have become a very dominant thing in the mindset of our younger visitors. So, for example, we have a new gallery that we opened recently called Power Up, which is about the history and future of the gaming industry. And so, quite quietly, people of my age hadn't really spotted that video games have become a mega thing, a mega thing. And so you can have all the debates you like about the effect on young people and a whole range of moral issues, but the reality is it's wildly popular, and our audience finds it a fun way of learning things. So the way we work here is that very often when we do an exhibition or a big new gallery, we will also create some gaming resources online as well. And the point is that in a fun way,
your own gaming resources.
Yeah, exactly. So when we created a climate gallery a few years ago, we created a game where you had to make choices, and the choices would lead to either good or bad outcomes in terms of, decline of food or disease or flooding. And so,
was this available for people
yeah, it was
online?
Online, absolutely, for free. And I can remember at the time, some trustees and other colleagues were a bit sniffy about it, thinking, well, is it scientifically rigorous? But the point is, it was scientifically rigorous, but it was done in a fun way. And also, increasingly, what's interesting about the future of video games is there's a kind of idea people have of my age based on video games in the 1980s, which is the lone person in their bedroom, just playing those games. Whereas now, of course, collaborative team playing on video games is a big thing. So I would say that's a huge shift for us.
It's interesting, you're using this medium to not resisting it.
Embrace it.
But you're embracing it and thinking, how can I use this
completely.
to keep education flowing?
Yeah. And it's also extraordinary when you spend time in the Power Up Gallery looking at the audience, which is, we use this phrase, don't we, about digital natives, but actually when you're in there seeing really young kids playing these collaborative games, you realize that actually if you don't embrace it, you will in fact consign yourself to irrelevance because it's so valued. But the other thing that's also been a huge difference in learning is that we've invested a lot of time in digitizing our collection. So we have about 7.3 million things, he says, boasting, but it's the biggest and I think the most important science collection in the world. And we've been making information about our collection available online because actually most of that technology is, of course, analog technology, but actually there's a huge audience for that. And it's a resource for students, be it at school or at university. That's really valued because people love the analog technology, because very often a piece of analog technology, like a steam engine, will tell you quite a lot about the basis of physics. Weirdly, it's become a bit cultish because a modern piece of technology can be a little anonymous to a user, whereas some old tech actually can be quite a revelation in terms of thinking about underlying scientific principles.
And you don't think the online delivery of your exhibition will hinder people coming to physically the analog?
Definitely not. I can think of so many projects we've done where we've had a big online audience, but in fact the physical audience has been huge as well. They sort of complement each other. So I don't think in any way one robs the other. That in fact they work in tandem. Also remember, of course, from our point of view, it's very important because we have a big international audience. Now, the whole world can't come to London to see every project, but actually knowing what we're doing and creating resources means that if we're spreading stories about good science and about the scientific method and great role models, that's a kind of win for us, even if people never walk through our doors.
Understanding what your actual mission is.
Yes, yeah.
That's great. Yeah. What about in 30 years? Where do you see science and your museum being in 30 years? If we're in 2050 looking back, or we're looking forward to 2050, how would the museum change?
Yeah, well...
How would the concept of learning change?
Yeah.
As we're educating our younger generations in those years, in 2050, how would they be engaged at that point?
I think you can imagine that that's quite a tricky issue for all museums, but particularly us, because all museums have at their heart a question about what to collect. And increasingly, if technology, and particularly medical innovation, is digitally based, it's not so obvious you can collect a particular object. But I'll give an example of something we've just put on display now, which is a good example of how you can do great collecting in a way that the audience still appreciates in a museum context. So we have a gallery which celebrates the Queen Elizabeth Engineering Prize, greatest engineering prize in the world. And in it are wonderful examples of great innovations by the winners, but also what young engineers are doing. But we've just put in a wonderful installation of a digital heart. Because, for example, one of the interesting boundaries of science is the concept of digital twins, using all this data to create not only maps of cities, but also of ourselves. We currently have on display a wonderful digital heart where the scientist who created it used MRI and ECG data from their own heart and something like 5 billion data points to create a model of a heart. And you could do that online, and some of it is online, but actually it makes more sense in the context of the Science Museum because we also have the world's largest medical history collection. So we can look at the boundaries of science by saying that here is something that could potentially have a huge impact on healthcare, but as you reach it, you're also in an institution that looks at great triumphs and great disasters in science. I think also the other thing that will be a huge change for us is increasingly, when you look at debates about the future of science, the relationship between climate change and health is a big thing. And I think that our collecting will be hugely focused on new technologies that match that boundary, and a lot of that is about big data. We haven't quite decided how we're going to collect about that yet, but I mean, let me give an example. So satellite technology is a very good example where we're increasingly thinking about the kind of stories we tell about space technology. So although there is a lot of debate about missions to Mars, in a funny way, that's the least interesting thing to me, because the most interesting thing is what, for example, the Indian space program is doing in terms of satellite technology that will map agricultural success and droughts in Bangladesh and
tangible,
flooding,
immediate.
tangible things. So I think, and that's quite an important point, because there's a lot of debate in the press about eco-anxiety, but actually when we talk to our vast young audience, they're actually in a different place. What they want to understand are the technologies and choices that we need to make, and that's a big role for us. So one of the things that will really change in museums is we're talking at the moment to a lot of major research organizations where museums are quite cautious places. So they tend to collect technology when it's pretty clear it's the right technology and it's been in the marketplace for 5 or 10 years. Actually, we're going to junk that whole model and just collect things the moment they come out of a lab. And not all of that technology will last forever, but actually giving people the really strong sense of the cutting edge of science is, I think, the demand from my audience, because in a kind of TikTok mindset, people want now, and waiting 5 years for new technology seems like a really radical and amazing piece of speed in museum terms, but it's hopeless for our young audience, really hopeless.
You could also have something quite innovative, but the market doesn't pick up, and it's the wrong time. And then later in 10 years' time, it's resurfaced again. So that's pushing the science element of the discovery of this innovation is quite interesting.
Well, I think also if you bring things into the floor of the museum quickly, it's very useful, because very often one of the things that young people and a wider audience want a say in are some of the ethical questions. So sometimes it's quite surprising. We did an exhibition on driverless vehicles, and interestingly, the audience response was kind of quite negative. So it still felt to the audience like it was a solution in search of a problem. Whereas in medical engineering, or indeed in climate science, people want to know what the choices are and kind of have a say. Also, because we have such a vast history of technology, I think it interests me because the history and future of science shows that many great innovations don't get adopted because they don't kind of win the hearts and minds of the public. And I think by collecting more innovative technology, we can bring that debate to the fore, so people can see, why do some technologies succeed and others don't? And it's not just about investment and scientific rigor, it's also about public appetite.
That's an interesting way to talk about also artificial intelligence as an innovation, as a moving, changing force right now. We're hearing a lot of interesting points about the negative effects of AI or the risks of AI. How do you foresee that? And how do you foresee that changing our the way we approach education and the way we approach exhibitions?
Well, I suppose I approach it with a slight wry smile in a way, because if you look back over the history of technology, it's been one moral panic after another. I mean, people forget the hysteria that greeted the birth of the railways and the hysteria that greeted the arrival of the car. And also, almost every big change in technology has predicted a collapse in the workforce, and invariably the opposite has been true.
Or another drama called the Y2K.
Yeah,
you remember
yes.
that?
Oh, I lived through that vividly, yes. I think what's interesting to me, and my sense is to the audience as well, are all the positives of AI. And so let me give you 2 examples. So already it's pretty clear, isn't it, that there'll come an interesting point where you go and see your doctor and you think you might have cancer. And the doctor says to you, well, you can be screened for it manually by the traditional systems or by AI. And there'll come a point soon where actually it will feel unethical to not use AI. I think it's also, when you talk to climate scientists, AI has enormous contributions it can make to the climate crisis in terms of data and sound systems that can map biodiversity, in terms of climate forecasting, migration, also a classic efficiency issue. So one of the things I'm slightly obsessed with is the vast consumption of energy by supposedly benign systems. So we all use the web and data wonderfully, but actually it's powered by a lot of electricity. And so in a whole range of areas, AI might make computer modeling vastly more energy efficient as well as good outcomes. So I think the thing that strikes me is there's a very, very strong analogy in my mind between regulation of AI and regulation of medicines. So just this month, actually, it was announced that one of the medical regulators in the UK is allowing Imperial College, which is my next door neighbour, to start trials using CRISPR technology to try and address hereditary blood disorders, sickle cell being one very good example. And the point, I think, is this, that going back to something you said earlier, one of the lessons of recent history is that good regulation can be a beautiful thing. And so let's not just assume that regulation is going to hamper innovation. I mean, the classic example, which is very, very popular in our current exhibition about vaccines, is that international regulators were able to give validation to the innovations in vaccines at incredible speed, and they just worked differently. And there's a bit of pushback from the paranoid about whether this was all some strange conspiracy. But the truth of the matter is, it's a wonderful thing, because actually, if the regulators work imaginatively with the pioneers, actually everyone can win. So rather than saying, and also then, because they've got the regulatory authority, then actually the new technology can be adapted and people have confidence in it. So there's a kind of view that, going back to the AI summit at Bletchley, that regulation should be stopped. I think it's more interesting than that. And also the idea that new technology, be it AI or gene therapy, should not be regulated is kind of absurd. I mean, it doesn't make any sense. It's much more likely that actually investment will flow and innovations will benefit the public, where there is a good regulatory regime. I think the anxiety at the moment is that our understanding of the human genome and kind of medical regulation is probably more advanced than AI. But although there are quite strong voices who are critical of the AI summit, I think that Rishi Sunak's instinct was the right one. And if you read the declaration they issued, what struck me, it was almost like it was written by one of my teenage visitors, because actually it said that innovations in AI need to be still democratic, human-centered, protecting the vulnerable. And I applaud that. I think that's a kind of good view of regulation.
I think that text certainly mirrors social impact and putting the stakeholders in the heart of the equation. The issue that I see when I speak to the innovators themselves is the opposite. There's a lot of ego at play. I'm the one who discovered this. I'm the one who released this to the public. I made a lot of money and increased shareholder value and so on. So it's again going back to that human element of how do we make all the relevant parties aware of all the stakes and all of the values that we are trying to instill and push forward and invest in. Then we move forward without hindering the progress.
Yeah, you see, I mean, I understand some of those anxieties, because obviously we work with a whole range of pharmaceutical companies around the world. And if we were to talk to people who have worked in that industry for a long time, the amount of capital investment and risk in drug development is extraordinary. And I think that for those companies, sometimes it can be quite frustrating getting the regulatory approval. And they will probably say that's become tougher and tougher. But on the other hand, in the end, good regulation does them a favour, because rigor in regulation then means that actually, going back to an earlier point I made about public sympathy, people will adopt it and have a reassurance that the system is great. And the reason I say it with some feeling is that we have in our medicine gallery a whole section on the thalidomide scandal. And you have to remember that actually, if you went back to the supposedly golden age of lighter regulation, it wasn't really much of a golden age, actually. I mean, there were lots of great things achieved, but also there were some real disasters where regulation was very weak and where the evidence was ignored. So, as ever, you'd expect a public servant like me to say, in the end, you're trying to find this serene balance between encouraging innovation, but actually protecting and nurturing the right environment.
Okay, yeah, that's very true. I'm conscious of our time,
Right.
but I want to jump a couple of questions.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
One topic I wanted to ask you, do you think, being essentially a scientist yourself, you watching all of this unravel in front of you, and you've been studying these variety of different fields over the last decade or so, do you think we are healthier as a society?
Well, first of all, I'm not a scientist. I mean, my degree was law. But I have this joke with my science colleagues that actually there's quite a strong link between thinking like a lawyer and thinking like a scientist. In other words, I relish logical thinking and evidence. But on your question, are we healthier? Well, the answer is, I think it's I'm going to give you a strange answer, which is definitely yes and definitely no. So here's the yes part. The yes part is that on the face of it, on certain measures, everything is great. So if you look at what I call the big sweeping UN kind of KPIs in terms of literacy and longevity, it's a great story. So human longevity has doubled since the start of the last century. And that's been true globally, so that's a great story. But I think there are sort of challenging elements within that. And one is obviously not just about quantity of life, but quality. So depending on where you live, I mean, there are big issues, especially in Western Europe, about the scientific investment needed in dementia research. So neuroscience is a big area which may enhance the quality of life. But I think there are also some slightly worrying things because I travel so much. Now, I was very struck recently on a trip meeting lots of scientists in India to discover just how much money and anxiety was going into diabetes research. So about 150 million Indians have diabetes of some sort. And that number is growing because, in the economic miracle is a wonderful thing, but actually it's creating huge health challenges. And then I suppose the thing that is an obsession for me, which gets very little public discussion, goes back to the very question you say about healthier life, but what about life itself? Because global fertility rates are in trouble. So if you go back to the year 2000, the average number of children per woman was about 2.7. It's now about 2.3, and the kind of maintenance rate is about 2.1. And also, if you look at this really amazing statistic that in the 15 richest countries in the world, the birth rate is below 2.1.
What are the attributes to that?
Well, this is the great debate, and part of it is social, which in some case you do expect to see birth rates decline with increasing prosperity. But also, I would say that what scientists are interested in is the effects of environmental pollution and stress in terms of fertility rates. And a lot of research is going into that area. And for me, it's very surprising because when I was a teenager, every year you would have a news item about the nth billionth baby being born, and it seems as if the world would expand forever. And if you look at the most recent UN report on population trends, you see something very interesting happening, which is, India is currently 1.4 billion people and will soon be 1.8 billion. But China, in the not too distant future, will be below 1 billion. European population will shrink. And yet, I know Kenya, Nigeria will boom. So it's both economic causes, but also there is a lot of evidence that fertility is in trouble. And so it seems to me that actually, isn't that the most fundamental bit of science that we should be trying to understand? Because otherwise, we have no real sense of what an optimum kind of level of human population is.
Yeah, there's also the element of mental health. And social health.
Mental health. Now, it's so interesting you mention mental health because something happened to us recently that really took us aback. So we opened just before COVID our new medicine galleries. It's the biggest collection in the world. Amazing history, going back right to the ancient Egyptians and Romans, right up to the very latest technology. And we have in this huge new suite of galleries a small section on mental health, including a quite challenging section on padded cells and old-fashioned treatments. And the overwhelming reaction from our visitors has been that they love the galleries, but they wish the mental health section had been much bigger. And it's very interesting for lots of reasons. I mean, first of all, the thing that gets very little publicity and is, I would say, is probably the biggest area I want us to do more work on is, billions is going into neuroscience. And most people have no idea the amount of spend. And that's relevant, obviously, to a whole range of physical conditions, but the general mental health debate. You look at the Wellcome Trust, one of the world's greatest medical charities, and mental health and neuroscience is a huge priority for them. So in a sense, I have this joke with my colleagues, which is, in the past 20 years, physicists have mapped out a standard model of the universe. And particle and quantum physics is very complex, but they've said this is sort of how it might work. But we are a very long way from a standard model of the brain. And this is me as a non-scientist. When I say it to neuroscientists, they get very cross, saying it's a gross simplification. And my response is, but I'm a citizen. And you're spending billions of my money, and I want to know where all of this is leading. So I think you're right that even 5 years ago, the scientists I meet and my own colleagues weren't really talking much about mental health. I would say it's other than climate change, it's running in tandem in terms of the need for focus and investment for us.
And it's an interesting topic, particularly for me, being a father of young children who are increasingly becoming interested in social media and all sorts of different mediums or media. The effects of social media are quite interesting on mental health. There's been plenty of data showing the advent of social media and the rise in suicides and the rise in a variety of different teenager issues and so on.
The thing is, I'm not sure I agree. I'll tell you why, because what's very interesting, I talked to my colleagues about this quite a lot, and there are still, I think, two quite big problems with research in that area. Obviously, I'm profoundly concerned because my life is full of those young people too. First of all, there have been a lot of studies, but there are two problems. One is, so often the sample sizes are quite small, and there haven't been enough longitudinal studies, but also I think the thing that's really tricky in this area is the thing that every scientist says to me endlessly about every topic is don't confuse correlation and causation. And so a classic thing is to say all these people over here were heavily interested in social media, and also a lot of those young people committed suicide. Actually, that's not evidence. So there appears to be a correlation, but the true scientists say to me there's still another stage of research needed to really map properly the connection between things. So what you're reflecting, which I understand, is a very strong instinctive sense that there are problems that need to be addressed. But I think that the scientists I speak to would say that actually scientific research needs to catch up rapidly, either to validate your instinct or show that something else might be going on. So I understand where you're coming from, and it's a huge area for us to address. But the scientific endeavour is still not as robust and methodical as you might expect it to be.
It's interesting. Yeah. You're saying that there's a gap in understanding of causality.
And I think it's interesting because when we've debated it internally, what's quite shocking is the number of studies is huge, but actually just a large number of studies doesn't mean the science is that great.
Last 2 points. Going back to education, which is one of our key kind of drivers in our summit. We have a whole panel on education. Future of education and the different tools used in education when it comes to science, training the next doctors, the next scientists, and so on. Do you see any trends there? You talked a little bit about gamification of education. Is this where you see it will eventually head? More kind of a visual, audio-visual engagement of future
The answer
doctors?
is maybe. I mean, we have done lots of experiments in terms of our exhibitions and education work with augmented reality, virtual reality. We haven't yet had what I call a eureka moment where we found something that really engages people. We've found that actually something rather more old-fashioned has become important to us, because the problem slightly with science museums everywhere in the world is that they do something which is very comfortable territory, which is show people the wonder of science. I think that's easy, but in fact, increasingly with some of our recent projects, we have given much more thought to how we work with teachers to help people make career choices. Now, that's quite strict and bossy. I mean, normally museums kind of stay away from telling people how to run their lives. But I think in more and more that will be important to us, because one of the things that's very, very striking, it's a particular obsession of mine, is that so much of the discussion about the scientists we need talk about sort of top-end scientists in research labs. Of course, that's great. But in fact, in the world of digital technologies, robotics, new technologies around climate change, there's what I call the secret army that's going to be needed, which is technicians. No one talks about it, except when I meet scientists, they say we're desperately short of technicians. So old-fashioned careers education, which is something museums have shied away from, I think is going to be really important to us. And I tell you why it's so important, because all the scientific establishment have realised we have the most valuable commodity of all, which they're so envious of, which is trust, which is that when people come to the site, seriously, one can take this for granted, but over and over again. And it's very interesting, in a recent survey of the public, they were asked which professions they trust the most. And doctors came out at 95%, nurses at 93%, and wait for it, museum curators at 90%. And so I'd love to show this to my former banker colleagues, saying, ha, we're much more trusted than you. But my serious point is this, which is that when we engage in scientific education and career education, the evidence would suggest we're much more likely to be listened to. And maybe that's the big contribution we can make to creating the workforce for the next 25 to 50 years.
Yeah, that's an important point.
Yeah.
And lastly, since 2010, when you began running this institution, you've clearly done and implemented many changes and done great work. What are you most proud of, would you say? What are some of the changes that you look back and think that was a fundamental shift, or I'm most proud of this particular thing?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting question, because it's very easy to list individual exhibitions or galleries, but in fact, ways of working and values are more important to me. So I suppose I would say two. The first is, one of my favourite phrases is dumbing up. And what I mean is dumbing up. And what I mean is that I have a bit of a beef actually with a lot of science museums elsewhere in the world, which is everything is kind of dumbed down, whereas actually the evidence from our audience research is whenever we've done some quite tough stuff, people are just much more curious and intelligent than you give them credit for. And they can take tough stuff. I'll give you two examples. We recently did a partnership with Cancer Research UK about the future of cancer treatment. And I can't tell you how many colleagues said to me, oh, you can't do that, cancer, difficult subject. They won't understand, it's too depressing, and the science is too complex. So I ignored this good advice, and it was one of the most popular things we've ever done, because actually people got the science, they were fascinated by the pathways for that field, but actually amazing things happened. So, families would come and see the exhibition, and invariably, one person in the family group had cancer, and coming to see the exhibition meant the family for the first time could talk about it. So that was pretty amazing. But then I think the other big thing that I'm really proud of is I'm a passionate internationalist. And so, we have an incredible international program. And to give an example of, how great this can be. So we worked with the Indians and the Chinese to develop this exhibition on the recent hunt for vaccines. Our exhibition has just been on at the National Science Centre in Delhi, seen by 1 million people. And the point is that, to me, it matters enormously that young people in India are part of our work, because scientists think in a very global fashion. And I just think that if you look at every challenge we face in terms of infectious diseases, mental health, climate change, it's a huge moral driver for me to think in an international way. I don't really care where the innovation comes from. So although I'm very proud that Britain has an incredible scientific record and is a superpower, it's clear to me, and also my audience, similarly relishes a global picture. They really care about an innovation that some young farmer is doing in Africa, or some amazing infectious disease program in Brazil where we also work. So I would say treat the public as if they're really intelligent, do really challenging material, and also take a global view. So I would say those three things I hope that I've ingrained in the mindset of this place.
And then you've also maintained that precious commodity of trust.
Yeah, and sometimes it's difficult. So, for example, it's quite well known that we still work with 3 oil companies, and we take the view that actually, they're part of life, and we need to understand how they make the transition. And some within the eco movement would say that by doing that, we've undermined the public trust in us. Actually, very interestingly, it goes back to where I started, which is that when you look at the data, what the audience actually thinks, the audience is on my side. So the audience knows that these problems exist, that the record of the oil majors is complex, but they rather that we talk about them and work with them than actually pretend they don't exist. So what that would say to me is that is also back to the risk question, which is, I think, if you take a risk for the right reason, although a lot of people will say you're going to undermine the trust and you'll damage the reputation, I think the sincerity of what we're doing is the thing that lies at the heart of maintaining the trust level.
Brilliant.
Okay, good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very
Sir Ian,
much.
thank you for your time.
Thank
you for having us.
Good.